welcome back. So today's topic is language and page titles, frames, and iframes, which sounds a lot more than it actually is. So we're covering only 2 test IDs. With a bit of housekeeping, as I already mentioned, we have the recordings on YouTube. Then slides and transcripts will also be uploaded to Google Drive as usual. I can copy you all the links into the chat in a moment, and you will also get all the short summaries on LE News because I realized that it is not always feasible to actually read through 22 pages of transcript every week. That is quite the task. And I don't think many people have the time for that. So it should be easier to do that just as a short summary. However, I still encourage you to look at the recording and definitely look at the interactive examples yourself. So the course is still paced that you should be able to follow it alongside the Trusted Tester Certification self-study course. So please make sure that you check in on that. Otherwise, it might get deactivated because your student account can get deactivated if you don't check it at least once every 30 days, from what I read. Then we also have the GitHub repository, which still needs some updating. But if you're looking for all the resources which are on the slide here, you will also find them within the GitHub repo. Then, as I mentioned, the first topic is language, so topic 11. Now we are more than halfway through. We have a total 20 topics to cover. So we're doing well on time, and language is a rather short one. So we have language of page and then language of parts. Starting with language of page, it is pretty straightforward based on we're missing one, but it's 3.2, 3.1 for language of page and then 3.12 for parts. I will fix that typo before I uploaded the slides. And also worth mentioning, because the Trusted Tester is building on the Web Content Guidelines 2.0, but we are already updated to the 2.2 version. They're in both of them. So it doesn't matter if you look at 2.0 or 2.2, but for the sake of having a more updated version, I would always recommend looking at 2.2. This specific success criteria, and actually today again, all the ones that follow will be the same. So you don't have to worry about that. And language of page says that the default human language of each web page can be programmatically determined. It is a level A success criteria, so it's one of the more basic ones that you need for your web page to function. How to test this one? And again, we have a little cheat sheet in the shared drive folder. At this time, I also included the screenshots of how to use Andy for the specific testing steps. And it also is sorted into tabs. So if you finish with the topic 11 criteria, then you have to switch to the other tests for the topic 12 ones, but they're both in the same one. So let me just get you the link so you can reference it here. And also keep it open on the side because sometimes it's just nice to have it open and follow along if the slides move too fast or if you just want to reference them for the examples, because I don't keep the criteria for evaluation and testing in the example slides anymore. So it's just that we don't drown out in slides here, which hopefully allows us to finish a bit sooner than usually. So definitely have an eye out on that. So here's the cheat sheet for today's session. And I would say language of parts is one of the longer ones for today. The rest will be rather short. So how to test it? You start with launching Andy structures. Then you click on the more details link in the page and then page language. And it will display a dialog listing the value of a language attribute assigned to the HTML element of the page. And if no language attribute is defined or if the attribute is empty, then we will provide a warning with the same dialog. After this, we have to consult the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, IANA, language subtag to register to determine whether the language is properly defined. What is properly defined, we will actually have an example of improperly defined and what it should be. And make sure that it matches the default human language for the page. Then you just press Ctrl F to open the browse search feature and look it up if it's actually there. Then we can review the subtag to determine if the code is actually correct and associated with the language that the page claims it should be. Now, here are some examples of what this code can look like. It can be for English generally, EN is used, but there are also regional language variations. So for example, in the United States, you have a different spelling than in Great Britain, and these are defined with ENUS or ENGB or ENAU for Australia, for example. So for a page in English, any of these codes codes would pass the requirement because as long as it's English, it is properly and programmatically defined, but these are all still the respective ones. Then in German, we have, for example, also the variations between Austrian German and German German. They don't really make a difference in the written language, but it is still a variation that can apply. How to evaluate it? If all of the following are true, then the content passes. So number one, you have to look if the default primary language is correctly specified per IANA, and then the identified language in the lang attribute correctly matches the default human language for the page. So that is not that much to look at, actually. And what I found interesting is that 11a language of parts is actually one of the few examples that has no option where it does not apply. So we don't have any does not apply examples today because it always applies in some form of text will also always be associated with the page. Then here we have a passing example where we're testing the DHS website itself, and we start this by launching empty structures, then we click on more details and then page language. And as you can see here on the screenshot, we get a little pop-up saying the HTML element has a lang attribute value of ENUS. Now this, as it's the Homeland Security website, and we also see a little American flag here in corner, is already a good sign. Now we have to consult the IANA language subtag registry to determine whether the language is properly defined. This indicates that the page is in English and English is spoken in the US. EN informs you that the primary language is also English. When we are going to evaluate, we need both of the statements to be true. So the default primary language is correctly specified per IANA. This is true because English is correctly specified, and the identified language in the lang attribute correctly matches the default human language for the page, which is also correct because English is the default human language for this page. And in this case, the content passes 11a because both results are true. Now, looking at a failing example, and this one is the first one you can try. We will have more of them later on. And here you can then, and you should already be activated on the page also, and then you can see the little dialogue. So when I switch over to it, so this is what you should be seeing. It is a bit small, unfortunately, here. Yes. So in this case, we have Andy activated, and we see that the page is in Spanish. So Andy also displays that the HTML value is SP in this case. Now, this is a bit of an issue. If we go here to more details, page language, then we get a little pop-up, which is unfortunately not catched by the stream, but it should be a dialog window within your own browser that opens, and that says a training section file where testing net says the HTML element has a lang attribute value of SP. So similar to what we have here on the slide as well. Now, when we're going to consult IANA with English and not English, Spanish in particular, you might not need that because some of you might already know that ES is the correct tag for Spanish, not SP. So in this case, the language codes are actually mismatched, and therefore the content fails 11a language of page because it is incorrectly defined. It should be ES instead of SP. And that already brings us to the next one. So language of parts this time, 3.1.2. Again, the same within 2.0 and 2.2. The human language of each passage or phrase in the content can be programmatically determined except for proper names, technical terms, words of indeterminate language, and words or phrases that have become part of the vernacular of the immediate surrounding text. And this is a bit advanced in the double A criteria. But I would argue it is quite similar to your language of page. And some things to note is that, for example, proper names are exempt from this because while you do have regional names, you do not really have a certain language associated with a name. Technical terms also, because especially in IT industry, I noticed that we have a lot of technical terms which are just English, and even across languages, they will be used in English, which might sound odd a bit at sometimes, but I have learned that it is more common than actually translating them to your target language. Then how to test this? Again, with empty structures, you click on the more details link as before. You look at language attributes, and if the number is 0, then no content was marked with a language attribute. Here in the screenshot example, we see that we have 2 language attributes present on the page. Then how can we test this actually? So we look at the markup, and that the markup that was added to the web page, it identifies the element which the attribute is applied to, and it should be highlighted in a similar style to here on the screenshot. So you can see that we have a divide up with the language set to DE for German, and then we have a small German paragraph which is outlined in a green line art. When you mouse over or tap to reveal the beginning and the end of the element and to determine whether the entire passage is enclosed within the element. So, for example, that actually all the German content is actually enclosed within the div saying language equals German, but it shouldn't include the educational games, which are then again in English. Then step number 3, we consult the IANA language tag registry to determine whether the language is properly defined again. This is similar to what we did before, actually. Not just similar, it is actually exactly the same thing, but now you're doing it instead of for the entire page, for just subsets. If the search does not appear by default, you can also use shortcuts and just go Control F to search up the language that you need. Then if all of the following are true, the content passes again. So the language for the content segment that differs from the primary default language of the page is correctly specified per the IANA code. And secondly, the identified language in the language attribute correctly matches the human language for the content segment. So make sure that, for example, if we have German content, it is not tagged as French, even if we have French and German on the page. Always make sure to check that. This is also something that cannot really be on automatic testing. You do have to pay attention to that. And here we actually have an interactive DNA example. And on the screen, we already have the instructions. So again, if ND is not open automatically, just give it a few moments. It should load. Then you go to structure and it should look like this. So we go to structures, more details. And here we can already see in the preview that we have 0 language attributes marked here, which is not good. This is not what we want. So let's go back to the screen. Now, in this case, the web page is actually written in English. It's a dinner party invitation, and it includes, again, Spanish and French words, meaning names of dishes in this case. So parts of the page have words that are in different languages, but they are commonly understood words, like hors d'oeuvre and fajitas, tortillas. And then we also have a name of someone who will be playing at the party. Then the page also contains a proper name of a person. Therefore, no language of parts needs to be identified, and Angry correctly identifies 0 language attributes. Now, in this case, language of parts does not apply, but language of page would still apply. And here we have a passing example for language of parts, what it should be. So again, we're going to structures and more details, and then we see already there's 1 language attribute. In this case, it is the translated sentence, and it is also contained within this, which we can make sure while hovering over it. So you can also see it in the screenshot attached here. Only the outline of the part is missing, which is defined. Then this is basically what we did in long again. When we're testing, we use ND structures. So we keep the more details and the language attributes. You have all the details also on the cheat sheet in the chat or in the drive folder, or just probably also on the event page. You have it everywhere. Then we locate the markup and make sure that it is correctly identified as per the IANA language subtag registry, and that it also matches the content's language. When we want to evaluate it, we are asking ourselves the language for the content segment that differs from the primary language of the page is correctly specified. So in this case, the primary language is English, and the subcontent segment that we need to identify is in Spanish. Yes, I'm sorry, I just had to double check if it was Spanish and not Portuguese, because it mentioned Brazil, but it was in Spanish. Then secondly, the identified language in the lang attribute correctly matches the human language for the content segment. This is also true, it matches, and therefore this one passes because both of the requirements are correct. And now we have a failing example, which is very similar. So in this one, the main question is, what's the weather like? So we're testing a web page that's primarily in Italian, but the heading is in English. So we're going again to structures, more details, and language attributes. And then we see that the H2 is defined as a language of parts, but it is defined as DE, which means German, and the content itself is in English, which is simply not correct. So in this case, as you have noted it on the slides, we see that the heading element section impacted by language of parts indicates that the language is German, but it is in fact not German. and the correct IANA code would be EN for English. Now, in this case, the content fails language of parts because the language of the content segment that differs from the primary page content is not correctly specified. Now, we already are at the end of topic 11. This was a very short one and very similar. So as a short recap, language of pages requires that web pages programmatically identify the page's default human language. So we use ANDI structures, more details, page language to check if the correct language is specified. And the subtag must be valid Internet Assigned Numbers Authority language subtag, or a IANA language subtag. The language of parts requires any part of a page that uses a language other than the page's default human language to be programmatically identified. It is the same steps as we went through before, but this time we are looking at subsections that are independent of the primary language. And then we have one more topic today, page titles, frames, and iframes, which sounds more than this and is arguably less technical than I anticipated it to be. So for topic 12, page titles, frames, and iframes, we have 4 total requirements, test IDs. And as you might notice, we actually only have 2 success criteria that we need to look at. So 2.4.2 and 4.1.2. Now, page title defined is again the same in 2.0 and 2.2. It's based on page titles, which makes sense if you're given the name. And it says that web pages have titles that describe the topic or purpose. So in this case, it is very similar to what we had last week with the heading structures, and that the heading also is cohesive with the content that is followed afterwards. It is a level A success criteria, so one of the basics. And how to test it? Again, we are still using ANDI structures, and we review the alerts in ANDI's accessibility alert sections to determine whether ANDI displays any of the following invalid HTML alerts. So we are looking out for either the alert page has no title or page title cannot be empty. Now, if ANDI detects any use of frame on the page, the message will say press OK to stay on the page and press cancel to test the individual frame. So it will give you a little pop-up again. And depending on what we want to do, we have to choose the correct one. So only the 2 alerts listed above need to be evaluated, and we can ignore any other alerts that stage page has more than 1 title tag for this one. So this is what an accessibility alert in ANDI looks like. In this case, invalid HTML alert, page had more than 1 title tag. Now, if the following is true, then a content passes. A page title is defined for the web page. This is all that needs to be. And then we can review the ANDI output to determine whether there are any accessibility alerts, identifying basically exactly this, that there is either no page title or an empty page title. And yeah, that we have no page title would not constitute a failure of 12 page title defined, because in order for a page title to be defined, we do need to have a page title in the first place, which already leads to the DNAs. Page title defined always applies because every web page must have a page title. Now we have already the passing example. So in this case, we are testing a travel website that covers the top 10 cities worldwide. And it looks like this. So here we have top 10 cities to travel to: Madrid, Washington, Tokyo, Melbourne, Lima, Santiago, Nassau, Atlanta, Dallas, and Lilongwe, which I did not expect. I didn't know that one. So now we are looking again at structures, and this time we actually want to look at if we have any alerts here. Now we don't get any alerts at all, which is already a good sign. So when we look at the alerts that we are looking for, so page title has either no title or page title cannot be empty. Neither of the 2 alerts have been displayed here. So when we go to evaluate for 12A, a page title is defined for the web page. The content passes 12A page title defined because neither of the 2 alerts is displayed. And this indicates that there is a page title defined. Now, this is where I would say we can go a bit more in depth compared to what the trusted tester does, because there are more ways than just ANDI to test a page title. Because it has to be defined in the code, you can always go and inspect and see if there is something actually in the script itself defined as page title. So in this case, let me switch back to the other page without ANDI. You can right click and go down to inspect, and I fear it does not translate because it's the browser. So let me just stop sharing for a moment and show you in the entire, now you should be able to see it. So when we right click, which you unfortunately still don't see, you can go down to inspect, and then you will have the console open. And now here you can look into the body or the head. And what you're looking for is this here, the title. I hope you can see it well. So in this case, we have the title in the header, which is where it should usually go. And it says top 10 cities to travel to. So the trusted tester process only builds on what Andy is able to detect. So it is very consistent on making sure that it is registerable by Andy. But I think it's always good to know how you can go beyond that and actually figure out how to test it, even if it's not strictly within the trusted tester process, because it is a rather old process at this point. And since we do have options to test things that are not specified, I think it's important to know how to. So let me go back to the presentation for now. And now we are going to the next one, the fail example. So in this case, we have a travel site again. And when we open Andy, we are presented with this little accessibility alert straight away. So this is what it looks like. We already have here highlighted, even if we're not instructors, I'm just in a default one as the page opens, so focusable elements in this case, but it doesn't matter which one we go to, we already get the accessibility alert that we have one invalid HTML alert. So page has no title in this case. Hope you can see it well. And it also doesn't matter if we change the modules which we are testing with, we still get this alert. It is really hard to miss in this case. So we already have the Andy structures showing one accessibility alert that the page has no title. And this means that the content automatically fails. 12a page title defined, because Andy structures shows that the alert is there and it has no title. And now we're moving on to something very closely related, but slightly different, the page title purpose, which is a bit more suggestive because it just states that web pages have titles that describe topic or purpose. So it is still success criteria 2.4.2, and it is still a level A record. But the purpose can be a bit subjective. Now, what we are looking for is usually, again, the same as before. So we're looking at more details and page titled in Andy. Then a modal dialog will appear and it will identify the page title. If there is no page title identified, then the content fails. 12a page title, and it also fails 12b page title purpose, because if there is no page title, it also does not have purpose, if that makes sense. Then, for example, an online website called the bookstore may have several different pages, which is usually the case. You have one URL and then subdomains, or could be subdomains, could be separate pages sitting under this main website name. And usually they are sectioned off in this case, home, mystery sections, maybe a nonfiction section, a scientific section. It could be anything. Like, for example, on the GDG page, you have the main page where you can look up for different groups. Then you have also the GDG Vienna page, and they are also called differently. But for documents and web applications, the name of the document or web application would be sufficient to describe the purpose of the page. This one in particular is here because for web applications, you can have dynamic content as well. And if you are getting a new message or a new notification, new content pushed to the top, then the title of the page itself should not change because we have a new content within it. So one example would be a mailing application. And just because you get a new email or a notification for a new email, that would not impact or should not impact the title of the page. It should still be your email inbox, for example. And when we go to validate, we have two questions to ask ourselves again, and both need to be true for the content to pass. So number one, the page title accurately identifies the contents or purpose of the web page. And number two, if the web page is part of a set of web pages, the page title accurately distinguishes the web page from other pages in the website. So if the page title does not exist or is empty, then it fails both A and B. And if the web page is part of a set of web pages, then the title has to be specific enough in order to distinguish it from the other ones in the set. Okay, so going back to page title purpose, it is again one of the few test IDs that have no DNA. There's no option that they do not apply, because as long as we have a page title, it also should have a purpose. And it always applies because each web page must have a descriptive title. So it is a pass or fail, but it's not possible that it's not applicable. And then for the first passing example, we have a travel website that has a page that contains a blog and a list of the top 10 cities. Again, similar to what we did before. Let's see if the cities have changed. And using any structures, more details, page title, then the page title is revealed as top 10 cities to travel to in 2018. So maybe they have changed since, and this should be sufficient to distinguish it from other pages. So for example, if it is a different year or a different blog post. So when we are going over to the page, here we have the top 10 cities. So we are going to structures, more details, and page title. Again, it displays as a little modal that you unfortunately cannot see on the share tab because it's in the browser. And it says top 10 cities to travel to 2019 edition. So it has been updated. Either way, this is enough to distinguish it. And as long as the title in the modal matches the title here on the page, then we are good. So in this case, when we evaluate it, the page title accurately identifies the contents or purpose of the web page, which it does. And the web page is part of a set of web pages because it is part of a blog. So yes, it is. The page title can help to distinguish the page from other pages within this website. So this one passes because both of these criteria are true. Now we have the same thing in failing. So basically we do the same thing, but we already get an alert from Andy saying that we have an invalid HTML alert and that there is no page title. So when I switch over again, you can, again, it says to do it with the select module structures, but you can already see I'm in focusable elements. It just shows up straight away. There's an invalid HTML alert and that has no title. So for this reason, it already fails both A and B. And now we have 12C frame title. So as I said, they are not, I'm sorry, I didn't take you back to the presentation. So yeah, this is the little module populated here that there is no page title, but it's the same as here on the invalid HTML alerts. And in this case, it fails both 12A and B because we do not have a page title. And that is already the end of the first two test IDs. So now we're moving on to frame title. So this one is based on name role value. So success criteria 4.1.2. Again, it's the same within 2.0 and 2.2. It has not been changed since then. And it states that for all user interface components, including but not limited to form elements, links, components, generated scripts, the name and role can be programmatically determined. States, properties, and values that can be set by the user can be programmatically set as well. And notification of changes to these items is available to user agents, including assistive technology. And it is a level A success criteria. Now, this one we have gone over before, so not one that should cause too many issues, at least on the success criteria part. It just applies to a lot of these test IDs. Now, again, we launch Andy. If a frame is used, Andy will provide a notification that there has been a frame detected, and you will get a little pop-up module again. You have to click on cancel to test an individual frame. Then Andy will list each frame and, if available, associated title attribute, which we are looking for here. And if there's no title attribute, we get an alert again. So in this case, be sure to review each frame title and not just the overall page title. Then we select the link to access each frame, review the frame to understand its content, because again, just because it is automatically detected as a frame title, it does not mean that it is a sensible frame title. And then we review each frame's corresponding title attribute to the meaningful description of the content. And for evaluating, we only have one question to ask. All frames have a title attribute that describes their content. As long as this applies, then we're good. Now here we do have some does not apply examples. So in this case, for example, we have the dhs.gov website, and upon launching Andy, we get no dialog box for frame appearing. This is actually the case for many pages or any page that does not use frames, which is still plenty of pages. So in this case, it does not apply because no frames are detected on the page, which already leads us to a passing example with frames correctly detected on the page. So when we go to this example, we have a weather forecast in this case, and we just need to wait for Andy to load. So when we launch Andy, it should give us my bad, it does not give it on the tab itself, it does give it in the browsers. So I have to show you in the entire browser again. And this is what it should be. So we get a little module pop-up in this case. It says training section 508 testing says select the frame, then launch Andy. So very sorry for the inception in between. So going back to the slides now. So yeah, So we launch Andy, we get a little dialog box that states Andy has detected frames. Then we need to click on cancel, and Andy displays a list of the frame titles. We want to select each link to access the frame. And in this case, frame A contains the menus and navigation links and has a title. Frame B contains the weather for Washington DC and the main content weather today then. So in this case, all the frames have a title to attribute, and they also correctly describe their content. So when I go back to the other page, you can see here we have frame 1 or frame A, title, menu, and navigation. When we click on it, we get a navigation indeed. And then we go back to frame B, which is the title, main content, weather today in DC. That is also the part that is displayed here. So we have, in this case, I guess, a screenshot of the mostly sunny Washington, D.C. at Friday, 9:30 a.m. So now here we had the same thing as a failing example, not interactive this time, but you get a similar view here. So you have a little screenshot of what it looks like, again with 3 frames, and 2 have a title, 1 has an alert that there is no title attribute on this frame. And in this case, the content fails because while we have frame A and B correctly identified and also titled, we do not have any title for frame C. And if it doesn't exist, then it also cannot be a descriptive title. So then we're already with the iFrame name, which is pretty adjacent to that. Again, it is based on success criteria 4.1.2, name role value, which I will not read out again. And we test it pretty much similarly, but we have, in this case, a separate module for it. We have the iFrames module, and where we review the output for each iframe, we make sure that it has a non-negative tab index value, or where the tab index is not defined, to determine whether the accessible name and description accurately describe the content of each one. Now, each iframe should have a name that is accurately described and also describes the purpose of the content of the iframe. Most of you will have embedded iframes, for example, which are embedded YouTube videos or similar ones, which is just multimedia cross-posting from different pages. The only question we need to ask when evaluating is if the output for each iframe in the tab order sufficiently describes its content. Now, we also need to pay attention that it is actually within the tab order, because if it is outside the tab order and it is not supposed to be visible content, then this one would not apply. Here we have, for example, where it does not apply. So we're testing an office internet site where Andy is launched. The iframe module does not display at all. So if it does not display, then we can be certain that there's no iframes on the page and they cannot be detected. So naturally, 12D iframe name does not apply if there are no iframes on the page. And now in comparison, we have, as a passing example, this is what it would look like. So we're testing, in this case, a website that uses an iframe on each page to contain the menu items, and no tab index is listed, which means that the iframe should be tested. So again, remember, only an iframe with a negative tab x value would be excluded from the test, because then it should not be visible. And I mean, sometimes people do mess it up, and even if it should not be visible and should not be on the tab index navigation, sometimes it still ends up there. So keep an eye on that. But according to the trusted tester process, we do not have to concern ourselves with that. Then the content passes 12D, because in this case, the Andy output for menu item or the menu iframe is descriptive, and it also makes sense for the iframe content. So the output is, in this case here, menu, and you can see this is indeed a menu. It contains home, about, contact, search. For example, navigation would also be an acceptable name in this case. And then we have one more failing example to try. So here is what it will look like on the side again, if we have the iframes module selected. So let me just open that one up for you. So here we are on the page now, and we go on the select menu to iframes, and this is what we get then. Now here we have a blank frame in this case, but it's supposed to be a map of Pearl Harbor. Now we already get an output that the iframe has no accessible name or title right here, and it also highlights the iframe it is referencing to. We also get it as an accessibility alert saying that elements with no accessible name. So in this case, there's no tab index listed, which also means this frame should be tested. It is supposed to be on keyboard navigation, and it is supposed to be visible. And the Andy iframe output is, again, iframe has no accessible name or title. In this case, it obviously fails because the output shows us there is no accessible name or title associated with this one. And it should also look like this. Instead, it is empty in this case. And that already concludes today's second topic. So again, going over the little summary, we had within topic 12, page titles, frames, and iframes, we had firstly 12a, page title define, which requires that a non-empty title attribute is defined for the page, and this test only checks for the presence of the title element. The accuracy is then checked within the next one, page title purpose, 12b, which requires that the title element correctly identifies the content or the purpose of the page. It should distinguish the page from other pages on the website, and for documents or web applications where the URL does not change, even as the content can change, for example, a mailing application, the name of the document or web application is sufficient in this case. Then similarly, C, frame title, requires that the frames have title attributes that also describe their content, and an iframe name, 12D, requires that iframes have accessible names that describe their content. And this only applies to iframes in the tab order, not if they are outside the tab order and not visible. So as you can see, they are quite similar and maybe not as technical as they might sound at first. And with that, we can conclude today's session quite early for once. So thank you for coming to today's session, even though it was, at least for me, it was a holiday. So I'm glad that somebody showed up. And our next session will be in 2 weeks, May 15th, again Friday, and same time. So it will be starting 2 p.m. or at least Central European summertime. The topic will be sensory characteristics and contrast, and also tables. So once again, here are all the resources. You'll also find them on the page of each event page. So I will drop you the link for the next session into the chat. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you there, hopefully. And I hope that you have a great rest of your Friday today.